Hello, everybody. Nice to see you. So this week, there are two lectures on core events in the history of medical and health-related research and how these events have influenced the development of research ethics guidelines. After my lecture, we will have some time for questions and comments. But first, my lecture, and please do not interrupt during my lecture because this lecture will be recorded. So the title of today's lecture is Core Events in the History of Medical and Health-Related Research and the Birth of Research Ethics. So this is the inventory of today's lecture. First, a prologue. Then I will reflect a bit on what I call the epistemological versus the ethical ethos of doing research. I will show you a video of around 8 minutes from the Nuremberg trial. The sound in this video is a bit rusty because it is from the trial period. Hopefully also we will have time to watch the video about the Nuremberg Code. If not, the link to this video you will see in the slides. Another video about the Tuskegee syphilis study. Then we are going to talk a bit about the hepatitic studies at Willowbrook State School, Staten Island in New York. And finally, the cancer injection study at the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital in Brooklyn, New York. So here is a prologue. It's taken from a 3-volume treatise on the history of hermeneutics in the 19th century by Joachim Bach. And I quote, "The world, how it is and how it was, is something we all strive to understand. That is the reason we do philosophy. That is the reason we do history. It is not true that to understand everything means to forgive everything. But it is true that only the one who tries to understand will grow and flourish. And that is why it is so important to dig into the history of medical and health-related research to try to understand why have these core principles become the most important principles in research ethics guidelines. And the reason is partly related to some horrible historical events in the name of medical and health-related research. I have 5 introductory questions. First, what are the epistemological and ethical norms and values underlying and guiding medical and health-related research? Epistemology comes from 2 ancient Greek words, episteme, which means knowledge, which means science, and logos, which means word. So epistemology, literally speaking, means words about science, but epistemology in philosophy is a term we use to label theories of science, theories of knowledge, theories about how we can generate knowledge. And also in medical and health-related research, we have some core principles related to how knowledge can be obtained. And these norms and values are in constant tension with the ethical norms and values that should guide medical and health-related research. We will look into the nature of these two different types of norms and values, from where they originate. Fourth, to what extent can medical and health-related research be of help in protecting and promoting basic human rights? And finally, in what ways may medical and health-related research inadvertently violate or abuse human rights? When we look at the history of medical and health-related research, I think it is non-controversial to say that this is a narrative with inherent tensions. That is, the history of medical and health-related research and of the birth and development of research ethics and research integrity is a narrative with inherent tensions. And in medical and health-related research, we have two competing rules of play or ethoses that we need to observe, to consider, to take into account. First, what I call the epistemological ethos of medical and health-related research. What do I mean by that? What I mean is the generation, the aim, the epistemological aim of medical and health-related research is to generate new, effective diagnostic, treatment, and prevention methods. And this scientific or epistemological objective must be paired with the ethical objective of medical and health-related research. That is the attempt to protect the interests and well-being of patients and healthy individuals who are involved in such research. Still, in the Declaration of Helsinki, for example, General Principle number 8, which I call the normative bedrock of medical and health-related research, state that the well-being and interest of the individual research subject must prevail over the sole interest of science or society. What do I mean by ethos? Okay, I used objective in the previous slide. Ethos is here used in the meaning of accepted standards. And the reason I do that is to emphasize that in research, two different types of norms and principles are at play. On the one hand, epistemological norms and principles. For example, the norm or principle of truth. All research in general, and medical and health-related research in particular, has as one of its aims to generate new knowledge, new truths, new probabilities. Another epistemological norms and principle that researchers need to comply with is coherence. For example, when you write a scientific paper. In medical and health-related research, you must, not the least in relation to funding agencies, you must indicate that this project you plan to start has some relevance, has some kind of utility, is fruitful. So these are some of the epistemological norms and values: truth, probability, coherence, relevance, fruitfulness, and utility. And then these epistemological norms and values must be combined with ethical norms and values and principles when you conduct research. Autonomy, dignity, justice, beneficence, non-maleficence, truthfulness, trust, vulnerability, and solidarity. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, at least 9 ethical norms and values, ethical principles. So the aim of my presentation is twofold. First, to provide a picture of what factors that may help to explain the tensions between the epistemological norms and values and principles and the ethical norms and values and principles. Second, what ethical norms and principles that actually underline and should guide clinical research or other forms of medical and health-related research, as well as how this normative system relates to the framework of values witnessed in relevant human rights documents. This course, if it has an underlying or core focus, I think it is right to say that it is inspired and informed by a human rights approach. So we have to take into consideration when we look at the history of medical and health-related research, and we look at how medical and health-related research is conducted today, we must look at the interplay between three different domains or systems. The system of ethical principles and norms that guide medical practices, which we could call the ethical domain. Ways of obtaining new knowledge in medicine and health-related research, which we could call the epistemological domain. And third, the norms and rules of civil society, namely the social and political domain. And these three domains are interrelated and interact with each other. That brings me to some of the research scandals and how these research scandals have influenced the shaping of ethical guidelines in research. We will now have a view of this video from the Nuremberg trial. I have to stop sharing this and then find this video. As I said, the sound is a bit rusty because this is from the actual trial, about 8 minutes.
Air Force. It includes the 3 defendants who are not doctors, and the defendant Rostock, who is an immediate subordinate of Karl Brandt, and the defendant Blome, a medical official of the Nazi Party, and the defendant Pokorny, whom we have grouped under the SS for reasons which will appear later. I will deal first with the military side of the case. Hitler, as Supreme Commander-in-Chief of the German Armed Forces, exercised his authority through a staff called the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces, better known by its German initials OKW, or Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. The chief of this staff, throughout the period with which this case will concern itself, was Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel. Under the OKW came the 3 supreme commands of the 3 branches of the Wehrmacht: the Navy, OKM, the Army, OKH, and the Air Force, OKL. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder was the Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy until 1943, when he was succeeded by Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz. Prior to the outbreak of the war, the Commander-in-Chief of the German Army was Field Marshal von Brauchitsch. In December 1941, Brauchitsch was relieved, and Hitler himself took the position. Hermann Göring was the Commander-in-Chief of the German Air Force with the rank of Reichsmarschall until the very last month of the war. And its own medical service. For purposes of this case, the medical service of the Navy is not of much importance. During most of the war, the defendant Harnloser was chief of the medical service of the German Army. In 1944, he was succeeded in this capacity by Dr. Walter. The chief of the medical service of the German Air Force through 1943 was Dr. Erich Hipke. From January 1944 until the end of the war, it was the defendant Schroeder. Subordinate to the defendant Schroeder are 7 other defendants from the Air Force. The prosecution's case relating to those crimes alleged to have been committed in the name of medical or scientific research. The charges with respect to euthanasia and the slaughter of tubercular Poles obviously have no relation to research or experimentation, and will be dealt with later. What I will cover now comprehends all the experiments charged as war crimes in paragraph 6 of the indictment, and as crimes against humanity in paragraph 11. It covers also the murders committed for so-called anthropological purposes, which are charged as war crimes in paragraph 7 and as crimes against humanity in paragraph 12 of the indictment. Before taking up these experiments one by one, let us look at them as a whole. Are they a heterogeneous list of horrors, or is there a common denominator for the whole group? A sort of rough pattern is apparent on the face of the indictment. Experiments concerning high altitude, the effect of cold, and the potability of processed seawater have an obvious relation to aeronautical and naval combat and rescue problems. The mustard gas and phosphorus burn experiments, as well as those relating to the healing value of sulfanilamide for wounds, can be related to air raid and battlefield medical problems. Also, it is well known that malaria, epidemic jaundice, and typhus were among the principal diseases which had to be combated by the German armed forces and by German authorities in occupied countries. To some degree, the therapeutic pattern outlined above is undoubtedly a valid one, and explains why the Wehrmacht, and especially the German Air Force, was interested in and participated in these experiments. Fanatically bent upon conquest and utterly ruthless as to the means or instruments to be used in achieving victory, and callous to the sufferings of people whom they regarded as inferior, the German militarists were willing to gather whatever scientific fruit these experiments might yield. But our proof will show that a quite different and even more sinister objective runs like a red thread through these hideous researches. We will show that in some instances, the true object of these experiments was not how to rescue or cure, but how to destroy and kill. The sterilization experiments were, it is clear, purely destructive in their purpose. And the prisoners of Buchenwald, who were shot with poisoned bullets, were not guinea pigs to test an antidote for the poison. Their murderers really wanted to know how quickly the poison would kill. This destructive objective is not superficially as apparent in the other experiments, but we will show that it was often there. Mankind has not heretofore felt the need of a word to denominate the science of how most rapidly to kill prisoners and subjugated peoples in large numbers. This case and these defendants have created this gruesome question for the lexicographer. For the moment, we will christen this macabre science thanatology, the science of producing death. The thanatological knowledge, derived in part from these experiments, supplied the techniques for genocide, a policy of the Third Reich exemplified in the euthanasia program and in the widespread slaughter of Jews, Gypsies, Poles, and Russians. This policy of mass extermination could not have been so effectively carried out without the active participation of German medical scientists. I will now take up the experiments themselves. 2 or 3 of them I will describe rather fully, but most of them will be treated in summary fashion, as Mr. McHaney will be presenting detailed proof of each of them. The first are the high altitude experiments. Subparagraph A of paragraph 6 of the indictment. The experiments known as high altitude or low pressure experiments were carried out at the Dachau concentration camp in 1942. According to the proof, the original proposal that such experiments be carried out on human beings originated in the spring of 1941 with a Dr. Sigmund Rascher. Rascher was at that time.
So 3 questions for reflection based on this video. What kind of studies were conducted? What was the common denominator of these studies? And what is the take-home message after watching this video? After I have finished my lecture, we can come back to these 3 questions, but keep these 3 questions in mind and try to remember some of the things that were said in this video. I will skip this video now, and you can have a look at it on your own. Then 3 further questions for reflection. What is the most important article in the Nuremberg Code and why? What does the code say about what level of risk is acceptable in a study? And third, why has Article 5 of the code raised new attention today? And we will come back to these questions after my lecture. Let's now move to the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study. As many of you already know, this study was conducted between 1932 and 1972 in Tuskegee, Alabama, United States. That is, it is a study that lasted for 40 years. Second, it was conducted by the US Public Health Service. So it was not some private lunatics who conducted this study. It was a study conducted in the name of the public health authorities in the US. The epistemological aim of this study was to try to understand how untreated syphilis progressed. And when this study started, that is 15 years before penicillin had become the standard treatment for syphilis, this was a justifiable aim to try to understand how syphilis, when untreated, progressed. The study included 399 impoverished African American sharecroppers who had been infected with syphilis. And for participation, the men were given free medical exam, free meals, and free burial insurance. They were not told they had syphilis. They were told they were being treated for bad blood, which was a local term used to describe several illnesses. The study started in 1932. In 1947, penicillin had become the standard treatment for syphilis. But the scientists behind this study decided to continue it. So they intentionally withheld penicillin and information about the existence of a treatment option from the trial subjects, from the patients. Not only that, in addition, they prevented the participants from accessing syphilis treatment programs available to others in the same area. So deception was involved. They told them, you are suffering from bad blood. Lies were told, and they actively interfered so to avoid that participants could access available treatment against syphilis, available treatment in the area where they were living, where they were suffering, where they were dying.
Did was shameful. What the United States government did was shameful, and I am sorry.
We have no idea how many wives, girlfriends, children inherited the disease and also died or were forever crippled by its effects.
For 40 years, the U.S. government-operated public health service conducted what was known as the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, one of the darkest chapters in American history. Now, over 40 years after the study ended, we still don't know and might never know the full extent of its effects. And the study might have continued if not for a 1972 article from Associated Press reporter Jean Heller.
Everyone who knew about this, to my way of thinking, everyone who knew about this and didn't blow the whistle, that didn't shout to high heaven, this is wrong, is culpable.
Syphilis was considered a national health crisis in the early 20th century.
You don't know a thing about syphilis, except that you've got it.
And many doctors at the time thought syphilis and other medical complications were affected by race. To study the disease, researchers found a population of poor, black, syphilitic sharecroppers in and around Tuskegee, Alabama during the Great Depression. Nearly 400 of the participants had syphilis, while another 200, the control group, did not. In the end, as many as 100 men died from complications related to untreated syphilis, and the message was very clear. Black deaths mattered.
Medical doctors deliberately let them die, wanted them to die for what they could discover from their bodies later.
How old were you when you first learned about the Tuskegee study?
23.
The day you published this story, the day the story was published, did you know what was getting ready to happen?
Yeah. I knew it would be explosive. After the story broke, and there was this incredible public outcry, Senator Kennedy had held very, very public congressional hearings on this.
If they had been white, your public health service would never have agreed to do this study in the first place. They wouldn't have dared.
The study and the aftermath are well documented in films and books, but there are still things we might never know, and for Heller, that goes back to the very beginning.
I still have not heard the answer to the very simple question of why. They should have been able to determine after the first 3 or 4 autopsies that the inside of a black person ravaged by syphilis looks identical to the insides of a white person, and stop the study.
Beyond that, Heller believes there's no way to know just how many people were directly or adjacently affected by the study or its disclosure. Survivors, victims of the study, and their families did win a $10 million settlement from the U.S. government, and the study's disclosure led to modern medical ethics procedures. But Heller says more than 40 years later, there's still at least one lesson to be learned from the Tuskegee syphilis study.
Those of us who recognize that this country has got so far to go, never quit fighting. Never quit standing up and yelling. I don't care if you're LGBT, I don't care if you're black, I don't care if you're disabled. You need advocates. You need people who can move the world.
Before I continue with the next slide, keep in mind this. Some of the experiments that were conducted by Nazi physicians and other healthcare workers during the Second World War, some of these experiments were therapeutic experiments. So the epistemological objective of these experiments were justified. But as I said in one of my first slides, there is a tension, constant tension between the epistemological objective of research and the ethical objectives of research. And if one of these objectives are given the whole priority, then you are in trouble. The same with the syphilis study conducted in Tuskegee, Alabama. When it started, the aim, the objective in epistemological sense was justified. But the researchers completely neglected the ethical objective. Just one other reference to the first video. The man who spoke mentioned Buchenwald. Buchenwald was a concentration camp where some of these horrendous experiments were conducted. Buchenwald was the concentration camp where my professor in philosophy was one of the concentration camp prisoners. His experience from these 5 years in the concentration camp made him change dramatically his own career. He had planned to work in the Foreign Affairs Ministry, but he decided to study ethics, and he became a professor in philosophy with focus on the ethics of research and the ethics of medicine and healthcare. Let's now move to the hepatitis studies that were conducted at this state school in New York named Willowbrook. It was conducted from 1953, and Willowbrook State School was an institution for mentally disabled children. More than 700 children, predominantly African American children and Puerto Rican, were included in these studies. And a subgroup of almost 100 children who were not infected were fed a suspension with the local strains of the hepatitis virus prepared from the stool of 6 children who were infected with hepatitis. So think just about this. They fed 100 non-infected children with a stool from 6 infected children. That in itself, how can you justify to feed extremely vulnerable children with stool from other human beings? Allegedly, written consent had been obtained from the parents of these children. But later investigation indicated that the parents' consent might have been based on indirect coercion, since volunteering their children to the infection study was put forward as a condition for admitting the children to care at Willowbrook State School. Krigman defended the infection and immunization studies his whole life with reference to their scientific merits, or what I call the epistemological objectives. And which were the objectives? According to Krigman, they were: first, his studies confirmed the existence of two types of hepatitis, A and B, and also show that these two viruses had different infection pathways, oral versus close contact. And he defended his studies also by claiming that he had prepared a crude vaccine containing the hepatitis B virus. And he justified the exposure of a small number of newly admitted children to the hepatitis virus with reference to: first, it was inevitable that these children were bound to be exposed to the same virus strains under natural conditions which were existing in the institution, because so many of the children already had been infected. His second argument was safety. They would be admitted to a special, well-equipped and well-staffed unit. Thus, they would be shielded from exposure to other prevalent infectious diseases in the institution. The third argument he used was immunity. They were likely to have a subclinical infection followed by immunity. And fourth and last but not the least, he insisted that informed consent had been obtained from the parents. I quote, "Only children with parents who gave their informed consent would be included." But the backstage was that this was put as a criterion for allowing these children to live and die in this school. Why am I showing these, or why am I focusing on these deeply unethical studies? Well, these studies are the backbones when we talk about, for example, the Belmont Report, when we talk about the Nuremberg Code, when we talk about the Declaration of Helsinki. None of these guidelines would have become reality in this way without the disclosure of these horrendous experiments. Keep in mind also who disclosed the horror of the Tuskegee syphilis study. It was a young female journalist. And this is also a recurrent thing when these studies, also later studies, have been discovered. It has not been disclosed, neither by researchers, with one exception, or by funding agencies, or by public health authorities. No, by independent, courageous journalists and historians. Let's now take a look at this second study from New York. Another study involving extremely vulnerable individuals. Dr. Cheston Southam had since 1953 conducted research on the role of the immune system in protecting against cancer. Two different groups of patients were recruited as research participants, and they were injected with a suspension of a foreign cancer cells to study the difference in immunological rejection between the two groups. The first group was a cohort of 300 patients at Memorial Hospital in Ohio who had different forms of widespread cancer. The second group consisted of 300 healthy individuals from the Ohio State Penitentiary, that is a big prison. And the studies documented that healthy individuals rejected the injected cancer cells faster than the cancer patients, 4 to 6 weeks after injection versus 6 weeks to 3 months after infection. In an interview in Science, one of the most prestigious medical journals, Southam admitted that although there was no theoretical likelihood that the injections would produce cancer, he had nonetheless been unwilling to inject himself or his colleagues. And why? Because, he said, there was a group of normal volunteers at the Ohio Penitentiary, fully informed about the experiments and who accepted to take part in the study. And then in the same interview, he said this, I quote, "I would not have hesitated if it had served a useful purpose. But to me, it seems like false heroism, like the old question whether the general should march behind or in front of his troops. I do not regard myself indispensable. If I were not doing this work, someone else would be. And I did not regard the experiment as dangerous. But let's face it, there are relatively few cancer researchers, and it seems stupid to take even the little risk." End of quote. A third part of these immune reaction studies was the injection of foreign cancer cells into 20 old patients with other debilitating chronic diseases than cancer. And the scientific justification was to get direct evidence that it was the cancer disease that caused the delay in rejection of the foreign cancer cells, not the fact that most of the cancer patients he had studied were elderly, debilitated, and with additional chronic diseases. And in addition, he warned against obtaining consent from the 22 old patients for 2 reasons. First, at Memorial Hospital, they considered it a routine study, much less hazardous than other routine procedures. And second, the only risk related to the use of cancer cells in these injections was the phobia and ignorance surrounding the word cancer. The phobia and ignorance surrounding the word cancer. In 1966, Southam was found guilty of fraud, deceit, and unprofessional conduct, and he was in particular criticized for assuming he was entitled to perform any kind of research without consent, as long as the research in question was scientifically justified. But in spite of the fact that he was found guilty of fraud, deceit, and unprofessional conduct, 2 years later, he was elected president of the American Association for Cancer Research for the period of 1968 to 1969. Then these 3 questions for reflection again. What is the common denominator between these studies? The studies conducted in German concentration camps during the Second World War, the Tuskegee syphilis study, the 2 studies on hepatitis and cancer conducted in institutions in New York. Which articles in the Nuremberg Code were violated? And third, would these studies have been justified if proper consent had been obtained?